So we'll get underway with this afternoon's closing session, and it's a great honor for me to not only be able to introduce but welcome our two speakers. First of all, we have Benoit, who's Chief of Staff for the Manitoba Metis Federation, and is also the Senior Advisor to the Federation's President, David Chartrand. You heard about him and his contributions and his work over the years in the international arena, but also not only to the President, but the Cabinet. So Al has over 20 years of experience, more than 20 years of experience building the Métis Nation government. So we'll hear from him now, and then we'll turn to June after. Al.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm glad you're all here. You look kind of sleepy. I guess that must have been a great lunch. I'd like to thank all the organizers, and I'd like to thank you for making this a success. I have to say that as a practitioner, I do often look at the international arena from more as sort of the night sky with all the stars, and often wish I could be up there. But I'm on the ground, and when I was here over the last couple of days, I was always asking myself, how can I take these bright stars or the pixie dust and bring it down to earth? And so how it is how do I go from UNDRIP, all the articles, the principles, and the good work that's being done in that space in New York and elsewhere, and how do I make real, tangible community benefits? How do I go from the international to the local? That's what is always foremost in my mind. And it reminds me, and I brought it up with someone earlier today, is for those of you who may have taken English literature at university, or maybe it was in high school, T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot, he talks about between the idea and the reality, and between the motion and the act lies a shadow. There's a dark shadow between our good words and successful action. So what I saw here identified were not only successes, but I also saw there were lots of gaps. And I know in room 206, I have to thank them and Jamie in particular for coming up with concepts like the gap. There's some gaps here. And there's gaps that have been identified in knowledge. For instance, many people don't know what the articles are in UNDRIP. Many people in our communities don't know that UNDRIP even exists. If you asked my mom about UNDRIP, she'd phone the plumber to work on the sink. So that's the kind of, there's a gap of knowledge, and how do we bridge that? And then there were lots of good ideas that were brought up over the past days, including in room 206, and I'm sure the other facilitators groups did the same. So there's also a gap in support. And the support, whether it be from the international, like we hear about the voluntary, the fund, we've also, from Canada, we don't necessarily hear or see opportunities for funding. And I mean, it doesn't always have to be funding. I mean, there's also support. Can be something as simple as making an introduction. It can be something as simple as patting you on the back and pointing you in a direction. It reminds me of an old story where I'm going to talk about one of these evil capitalists, John Rockefeller, used to be a big oil guy. Well, he had one of his employees come to him and say, Mr. Rockefeller, I need a loan. And Mr. Rockefeller first says, well, I'm sorry, we're in the oil business. We're not a bank. We don't give out loans. But come with me for a walk downstairs to the lobby. So they go down and they come to the lobby. He says, come with me out to the sidewalk. And then he put his arm around his employee's shoulder, patted him on the back, and then pointed across the street to the bank. He says, you go to the bank, they'll give you a loan. And the employee goes, well, they don't know who I am. Are you going to write me a letter of reference? You going to co-sign my loan? He says, no, they saw me pat you on the back. They will give you a loan. So in many ways, we need our states, we need our governments, we need, for those of us here in Canada, we need Canada to take that type of action. And I was just speaking outside to Jasmine about my experience. I was down in Chile for the World Indigenous Business Forum. I don't know if any of you have heard about that. It started here in Winnipeg, and they have different spots around the world and where they have these conferences and invite the local businesses to get involved. So we're down in Chile, met with the trade commissioner for that part of Latin America, and got a business card. Get a hold of us if you're going to do anything in Latin America. So we're planning at that time to go to Colombia, go to Bogota and elsewhere. And I'm sending emails to this guy trying to make the connection. And I'm getting no support from Canada. Now, obviously this guy's getting paid, to work at least 9 to 5. So he's helping someone, but doesn't seem to be going out of his way to even respond to the emails coming from, well, not as brown as I could be, but from a brown face. So that's a challenge. All he had to do is make a few introductions, pat us on the back, and say, hey, the Métis Nation has our confidence. Communication was another gap. Not just communication between us and people in other countries, but even amongst ourselves. One of the things that we discussed in our group was how in Western Canada here, we had what was called the Iron Confederacy. How many here have heard about the Iron Confederacy? Wow, and he's not even from Western Canada. But the Iron Confederacy was the Plains Cree and some of the Woodland Cree, the Métis Nation, the Assiniboine, I believe they're related to the Stoney somehow, and the Anishinaabe. And they all created a confederacy for trade and for protection, because there are other confederacies out there of other nations. So the idea is you can get nations together. So when we start looking at communicating, who are we communicating with? And that was one of the things that we may want to try is treaties amongst ourselves. We don't need Canada to tell us we have to have a treaty. I mean, as the Métis Nation, we had treaties with the Anishinaabe and even with the Sioux. After we had a couple of battles, we sat down and said, we can't keep doing this. You lost a son, you can have my son. Let's sit down, let's figure out how we can work together. And this is a big one. It's not fully a gap, but it's become very important. And I think it's important for identifying, if this is a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, who are Indigenous peoples? Now, among Indigenous peoples, there's a hierarchy. There's the people that were the so-called non-status. They're usually near the bottom of that pecking order, the chicken pecking order. And then there's the Métis, or Métis Nation. They're pretty close to the bottom of the pecking order too. I've had people say the Métis are not really Aboriginal. That was back in, after 1982. And then after the courts, acknowledged that we were Aboriginal, and then we had rights as an Aboriginal people, then there came Daniels. And then in Daniels afterwards, people are saying, well, you're not really Indigenous, so you're not really part of the big plan for Canada's Indigenous peoples. So those are the kinds of things we need to talk about, is about identity, and hopefully talk among ourselves. But what's really important right now is we have on Eastern Canada, we have these groups that were founded by white supremacist and anti-Indigenous lobbyists. And they've created groups in Nova Scotia and Quebec and elsewhere. And they've got well over 10,000 members. Are they Indigenous? Are they Aboriginal? Well, they're trying to be. But they just started being identified or self-identifying these last few years. And they have, for 25% of them, they don't even have any kind of Aboriginal ancestor. And the other 75%, their Aboriginal ancestor is one First Nation woman, Algonquin or something or other, or Mi'kmaq, back in the 1700s or 1600s. So they believe that they're an Indigenous people. We know that's not, we around in this room know that's not what Indigenous peoples are, but we have to convince the state of Canada, for instance, not to be providing funding to these people. And some of my federal colleagues here will say, well, they're not really doing that. We're not really doing that. Well, they support the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, CAP. And CAP represents some of these organizations. So there's a gap on identity, a gap on communication, gaps in support, and gaps in knowledge. So how can we close these gaps? And some of the ways that we talked about it in our group and amongst ourselves when we're walking, what I've heard from other presenters, is that we need to have, in order to fill these gaps, we need more fora for us modern English people. We need more forums. We need more forums. We need more ways to get together like this. This is awesome. I learned so much. I was saying to Jasmine earlier that I was going to pull up my checkbook and write a tuition check. And I didn't know who to write the tuition check to because I learned so much here. Now, we need Canada and ourselves to be working on liaisons. We need the United Nations to have liaisons. Like when it was, other than the Special Rapporteur, who we've had 2 versions of the Special Rapporteur come to the Manitoba Métis Federation in the past. Well, how do we ensure that happens regularly? How do we ensure that information gets to the rest of our community? So we need to have liaison. We need to know what's happening there and how we can apply it at the local level. One idea that came up is internships. To close that gap, internships. Now we understand that those exist, but I've never heard of them before. And you know, it scares me, is as if there's anything happening in the Manitoba Métis community, in my area of the Métis Nation, I'm supposed to know. And I have to admit, you know, maybe it's Socratic wisdom, I know nothing. I don't understand about internships. And we need, through the internships, through liaisons, through these fora, we need to be able to have articles, principles, and the institutions of United Nations be filtered down and fully understood by our people. Now, I've said all this about Canada, United Nations, but really the principle that I'm trying to get out of this is that we have to rely on ourselves. We have to take the bull by the horn, so to speak. And as Indigenous peoples, we can't rely on the states. We have to rely on ourselves, and we have to build our own supports. Now, of course, we're not going to let Canada, if for those of us in Canada, we're not going to let Canada off the hook. I mean, not only they're still taking our land and our taxes, you know, they're the ones in control of the larger financial apparatus. Now I'm starting to sound like a Marxist, but the idea is that we need to rely on ourselves. Good old self-help. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a self-help book at the bookstore that I can buy on this. We'll have to build it ourselves. Although maybe we don't have to completely build it ourselves. I take off every Christmas, and I was reading a book recently, a biography of Saul Alinsky. How many of you have heard of Saul Alinsky? Okay, he was really big back in the 1930s and 40s and all the way through the 60s of doing community organizing. He was very famous in Chicago with an area called Back of the Yards, where he worked with the churches, he worked with the unions and others, and was able to get better conditions for the people there. And then in some areas he worked with the black churches and the white churches. He worked with various organizations, white and black, and this is the United States back in the 1950s. And at a time when things like this just weren't done. And he was able to organize them together to get democracy and rights and be able, not the same kind of rights as Aboriginal peoples talk about, but other human rights. So it's all about community organizing. So go to the bookstore, if we may not be there, go online to Amazon and get some Saul Alinsky, 2 books that he wrote called Reveille for Radicals. He wrote originally, I think, in the 1940s and then updated it in the 1960s, and then another book he wrote in the 1970s called Rules for Radicals. Now, I'm not promoting Saul Alinsky in a way that's going to put any money in my pocket, but it's about we have to organize ourselves as communities and work with Canada and the United Nations and other countries and other Indigenous peoples around the world. When I talk about community organizing, I'm talking about a larger community. Talking about within our community, like in the Manitoba Métis here, for myself, if you're in Treaty 1 First Nations, working together, working among, and I guess I'm going to redefine the word here somewhat, work on an international level. International doesn't necessarily mean geographically international, but in a way international as being inter-nation, between nations. That's the way we have to start thinking about it. So the Manitoba Métis, what we've done with the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia is we've signed an agreement in order to deal with that issue of these Métis that are popping up that are not really Métis. So that idea of we're working together as peoples, we haven't done things like that since the Iron Confederacy. I understand in 2014 there was an agreement signed with many of the Southwestern First Nations called the Buffalo Treaty. So those are the kind of concepts that we need to be moving on. So I'm going to talk about what are we going to get out of this community organizing? What are we going to get out of these international relationships? Well, we're going to have to, it's both a product or a result as well as a cause, is cooperation, negotiation, have trade, exchange of ideas, sharing of programming. Well, I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman's name from the territory of the Russian Federation who gave the presentation. What I caught was the Maori program that they had borrowed. It's a program that's been used elsewhere. So the Manitoba Métis Federation here in Winnipeg, we have a program called Standing Tall. And Standing Tall, we actually borrowed from the Maori. What we did is we traveled to New Zealand, they came here, we had that exchange of ideas, and we took a program that in New Zealand was more or less focused on the transference of language and culture and knowledge. We took it and modified it here to keep kids in school. So we have a few schools in downtown, we have a few schools in downtown Winnipeg here that actually use that program. And we just don't use it for the Manitoba Métis. If there's First Nations individuals who live in the urban centers, their families, their kids use the same program. So that's the kind of thing about working together. And then there's also communications. Communications amongst ourselves is important. And how do we do this? How do we do this cooperation? How do we do the communications and the community organizing? Well, we dig into our own pockets if we can. And we get federal and other supports. And then we work together. One example I want to use where I thought there's a lot of potential here, it started but it hasn't finished, is I was asked with a number of my First Nation colleagues to go down to Mexico City as part of the Canada-Mexico Partnership, which is a side agreement to the old NAFTA. And what we did is we talked about the duty to consult. And in Canada, we have Section 35 of our Constitution. So if there's a corporation that's about to go into our territory and affect our rights, first thing we do is we call our lawyers. And we start papering the file, because we have some level of confidence in the courts that we are able to take this to court and have some sort of accommodation. In Mexico, they don't have something alike to Section 35. So one of the first things people do is they pull out a rifle. And so the idea was we did exchange ideas. They gave their presentations about what they're trying to look for. We gave our experiences. And everybody's talking about mediation. Maybe there's something in between shooting, using real bullets or using words for bullets with our lawyers. Like maybe there's somewhere in between, but that's the kind of thing. So Canada has not continued that process. That's the kind of process we need to have, constant engagement with our people in Mexico. Now, I really appreciated this fora. I know this was billed more or less as academic, but the academicians or the academics are the beachhead. And as one of my colleagues said, you're pushing the envelope, which is fantastic. You have the connections, you have the knowledge, you have the students, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, wanting to get things done, advocates. Please work with us. And not as a charity, but as partners. And together as partners between ourselves and the university, like between the Métis, the First Nations and the university, between the universities and UNDRIP, or the United Nations, us and all the other peoples around the world, we can move forward on the articles and accomplish what's being done at the United Nations and bring those stars down to earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. We'll go right to June Lorenzo, an attorney and consultant. In a way, she exemplifies what Al is just talking about, because she works at the local level in her own community. She's a Laguna Pueblo and Navajo Diné background. And she works in her home community of the Laguna Pueblo. I had honor to visit the community, and she works with the community organizations and Indigenous NGOs to address uranium mining legacy issues, among others, and resistance to new mining, sacred landscape protection, and recent issues of repatriation of cultural patrimony. And I know June has been a long-time warrior in this area of international work. So June, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you? Oh, good. Gwatsi hopa, the watchdraw, guide the watchdraw washrab in my Karis language, do yat in my mother's language. It's been amazing to be here and to see colleagues who I've known for a long time and to see how the work is carried on. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and of course, what we call in our language, the kupeshtaya, the spirits. I want to acknowledge them because we believe we don't get our work without acknowledging their presence, because they're everywhere. And I want to thank Miriam and Brenda for bringing their little ones. For both my people, we have beliefs that little ones until a certain age are really not part of the human race, that they're still part of what we call the holy people. So I really believe that we've been visited by the holy people in this place. I want to thank both of you for bringing your babies so we could be blessed by them. It's been really wonderful to have them here. So I'm going to try to limit my comments to sort of 3 areas that I've thought about in reflecting on this event. One is the idea of saturating the UN system that Daley talked about. The other is the concept of responsibility. And then finally, I want to just list some other UN agencies that we haven't talked about during this meeting. So going to Daley's comment, I think it's really important to remember basically what Daley said was the idea of the declaration and others was really to saturate the whole UN system with Indigenous people's perspectives, and I would add worldviews. So simple, so important. And also, with that, a couple of thoughts. I was privileged to be among the many, many people who were involved in the negotiations for years, and the UN declaration, and I'm not going to call it UNDRIP, I'm going to try not to anyway, was really crafted, thought about, by a lot of people who were not academics, who were not lawyers or academics, but there were many elders, there were many activists, many of whom didn't have, initials behind their name, and they were so important to the process. So I think it's important to remember this is not an area that's reserved for lawyers and academics, and certainly not anthropologists, because they were, they've had a key role in this process, but now this is something that belongs to everyone, every discipline. And so I want to stress that. Also, I want to underscore something that Daley said, which is absolutely true. We have been objects and the subjects of international law from the very beginning, so we have a very legitimate place in these institutions. And one of the ways, if you're thinking, well, how is that? Well, I mean, doctrine of discovery, for one. It's affected a lot of, almost every piece of indigenous land. I mean, very much international law and practice. And so in implementing the UN Declaration, it's so critical to hear from people like Indigenous leadership, people on the ground, people doing the actual administration of Indigenous programs, looking at the different areas. That's so critical to make it real on the ground. Way more, I would argue, than law review articles or academic articles. They're important to teach a certain group of people, but to make it real on the ground, we need the people who actually do the day-to-day and incorporate it in their briefs when they're arguing, who take the principles when they're drafting their own laws or negotiating legislation in their own particular context. And I would also say, and I say this more and more to youth from my community, that we don't just anymore, of course we always need lawyers, we could sure use doctors, but we also need folks in all disciplines to be engaged in this work. Hydrologists, geographers, cartographers, people in health professions, education, every discipline can find a way to engage. So I want to stress that as well. And then listening to a number of the speakers, I think two, including Ed and some elders, I want to talk about how when I talk with folks in my community, and when I think about the challenge of translating it, well, Navajo language is a written language, and the Keres language of my father's people is not, so it's more like interpretation. So how do you translate, interpret these concepts? And very much the elders in my community where I live now would say, it's very hard to talk about rights-based language. They can much more easily talk about responsibility. And so I know very much in the languages and ways of our peoples, there's a real strong sense of responsibility. So maybe rights vis-a-vis the states, but certainly responsibility. Just like Al said, just do it. It's a responsibility. It got handed to you. It's been handed to you by many generations. So taking care of protecting what we have, what Creator has given us, all those things that are listed in all the articles of the UN Declaration, as well as the American Declaration. And so one of these questions came up in our small group. How does this declaration sound in your language? How do you translate? How do you interpret those concepts into your language? Does rights translate easily? Or, and if you look at the, I just looked, did a quick search, because I remember during the negotiations when we insisted on keeping the word responsibility in Article 25. Because people said, wait a minute, this is a rights-based document. We don't need responsibility in there. If you look at the language in Article 25, we insisted on that word because we insisted that when it comes to lands, territories, resources, we have a responsibility to future generations. So it's in Article 25. The only other place that responsibility, I believe, appears is in the preamble. There is a paragraph in the preamble regarding well-being of children, and there's one on the paragraph regarding treaties, and those are both on page 106 in your little handy-dandy little books. And then related to this is our Indigenous laws, our own Indigenous laws. One of my pet peeves. First of all, I'm going to draw your attention to a number of articles that relate to Indigenous laws or legal systems. Article 5, Article 11, paragraph 2, Article 27, Article 34, and Article 40. And there may be more, but that's what I recall right offhand. But one of my pet peeves, and I was involved in both the UN and the OAS negotiations, is it says juridical systems or customs, and it says where they may exist. And I remember negotiating that in the OAS negotiations, and we tried to say, don't put in that language. But state representatives, a lot of the international community really don't believe that we all have our own juridical systems, that we only have our own legal systems. And yet, international scholars, one in particular whose name I'm not remembering right now, but one of my colleagues and dissertation committee, her name is Christine Zuni Cruz. She's written and published on what are known as Chthonic legal traditions. Indigenous legal traditions are one of the 7 major legal traditions of the world, right up there with civil and Jewish law and all of these. So let's let's not downplay that we've inherited one of the oldest legal traditions in the world. And it may not look like civil law or the common law, but it's there. It's everywhere around us. And so I would invite you to think about that when we talk about how we translate, these provisions, not only for ourselves, but how we tell the rest of the world what our laws are and what's important to us and why we're asserting the things we want to assert, because according to our laws and our systems and our customs, this is what must be. And I heard it a lot by the speakers who talked about child welfare, especially, certainly about land, certainly about protecting culture and education and so on. And I think that's a very strong place to come from. And I just want to underscore that from some of the speakers. And then with the last few minutes, again, this idea of saturating the whole UN system, I want to just list a number of other places where it's important to bring in the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as well as the UN Declaration. So one of the places where I've started to engage is the World Intellectual Property Organization. They focus on 3 areas: genetic resources, as in seeds and human DNA, traditional knowledge, and then what are known as traditional cultural expressions. And the idea originally, 20 years ago, was to come up with an instrument that protects these, but it's going in the opposite direction right now. And that's one of the places I would ask people to pay lots of attention, because at least for the United States, I went to my first session maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and there are states that are challenging using the S after peoples. There are people that are resisting self-determination in the document. And I felt like I'd gone back 20 years in time. And it continues to be that way. And so it's one of the most critical places to pay attention, and there's so little engagement there right now. MRIP has made some communications, thank goodness, and I think Permanent Forum has, or I'm not sure, has Permanent Forum done any communications? I don't think so, but MRIP has, and a number of Indigenous experts have gone to this body and stress the importance of applying the standards contained in the UN Declaration. So that's one of the battles. The Forum on Business and Human Rights. A number of you in the presentations talked about international corporations and their impacts on Indigenous lands. In November, there's a forum on business and human rights, and out of that came this process to elaborate a binding instrument on transnational corporations. And that's very important because a lot of the damage that's done in Indigenous territory is done by transnationals who have little accountability. Of course, monitoring bodies. Daley talked about almost all of the speakers addressed monitoring bodies. In the U.S., it's embarrassing. There are so few human rights treaties signed that we have to grasp onto the ones. And right now, we're involved in trying to engaging in the U.S. It will be reviewed for its compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. CERD, the CERD body. All of these need to remember and need to know about the standards in the UN Declaration as well as the OAS Declaration. And this is, the speakers address this, Brazil, the lands, the USA, sacred areas, talking about language and so on. All of these standards apply. Let's see. And then, just going back, if you look at, just a reminder, during the drafting and negotiation for this UN Declaration, It wasn't, and Vicki can tell you this, those who Willie, Ed John, they can tell you that it wasn't drafted in a vacuum. Every single, especially in the later years, always took into consideration other international conventions and so on. So it wasn't drafted in a vacuum. If you look at the preamble language on page 107 of your little books, you'll see it takes into consideration other conventions and so on. So it wasn't drafted in a vacuum, negotiated in a vacuum. It shouldn't be implemented in a vacuum. So it's important to keep those other things in mind. And I guess in closing, I just want to say one thing that I think is so important that Indigenous peoples have taken into the work. I set my own alarm. Is this idea that many of us have that we couldn't, everything that we have to protect was given to us by Creator. All the gifts, our language, our people, our lands, and so on. And so it's important, as a number of elders have reminded us during this session, always to be mindful. This work doesn't get done without the spiritual. And that's one of the things that we can take into this work. It's very important. Not everyone does it. And I think it's a dimension that we add to this work that's so important that when part of the saturation that Daly talks about, I think, is to take the spirit into all of this work and whatever we do. And I'll just close with one story that I remember. I'm not a storyteller, but I'm reminded of something. The first time that we had an official negotiation meeting in the Organization of American States, great tension, a lot of nervousness. Who are these Indigenous people? What are they going to do? You know, in those days, we didn't even have a seat at the table. We had to get permission, and it was one of the Caribbean states that gave us their seat so that we could speak at the table. And then in another instance, we said, oh, we had to listen to all the states for one day. Then they gave us like 15 minutes for the entire day. Thank goodness by the time we finished, it was, not that case at all. But there was a lot of nervousness, and I remember that Willie invited some elders who I think were in Washington, D.C. for some other reason. And they wanted to start off the meeting with some songs. And so, man, you could see the tension in that room. These diplomats were so nervous because I think it was out of ignorance about who we were. And they were used to the anthropological descriptions of who Indigenous people were. So here we are, we come. And they brought, I don't know how many elders came in, Willie, but they brought in their drums. And in that OAS place, when they sang those songs, you couldn't not be moved. And that, I think it was an important way to begin because it brought the spirit into these negotiations. And that was very powerful. So it reminded me again that taking that piece into our work has always been and will always continue to be important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, June. We do have a little bit of time. We may want to have a short dialogue. I remember actually going to the United Nations initially 42 years ago now. And it was a place where you gave presentations, and there was, that's it, you'd give a presentation. So I had to go back to the elders and report, as I always had to. And I said, yes, I just came back from the United Nations, and dialogue almost broke out. So we'll try and have a little bit of dialogue here. I just want to add one other piece to June's presentation. We're very missing in action at the World Trade Organization. And I think we need to consider that opportunity as well. But also, thank you for bringing the spirit back. I remember actually the first time I was asked to go and ask for permission if we could open a meeting with a prayer. And I went to the chairperson and I said, I'm here on a mission from the caucus. Can we open the meeting with a prayer in our traditional way? And she said, Willie, you know that we do not pray at the United Nations. I said, well, it's not really a prayer. It's an invocation. It's a thanksgiving. And we ask our elders to come. And she said, then how long is that going to take? So I tell her, watch. I said, I don't know, it's elders, you know. We have to respect the elders. So she said, okay, you have 3 minutes. So I went back to the caucus. I was really happy, and I said to the elders, guess what? We can actually open a meeting with a prayer. So when they open the floor, please come up. So the chairperson actually opened the meeting. And the elders had hand drums. So they brought these hand drums, and they started singing a prayer song. They're singing, and she pokes me in the elbow. How long is this going to take? It's 7 minutes already, she said. But the purpose I tell you that story is it's interesting about the contribution of Indigenous peoples to the international family. And from that point on now, every meeting starts with a prayer at the UN. And that's what our people brought to the human family. But not only that, as you know, the international mechanism is usually about economic, social, and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. But since the Indigenous caucus started attending the international fora, there's now a new right, a sixth right that's recognized for everyone. And I'm glad it was referenced here, and that's a spiritual right. If you look at the Declaration, for example, it does, in several places, talk about spiritual rights, our spirituality as Indigenous people. So I just thought I would share that quickly with you. By way of recapping that Chief Ed John was going to do, and then we'll get into a discussion. Plus, we want to honor some note takers and volunteers before we finish our day here. But we began by honoring, of course, the Treaty 1 territory and the Métis homelands. And I wanted to add to that Winnipeg, others say, and the University of Manitoba for hosting us here. And again, remind us about Elder Mead's opening. And it's interesting, and I'm so happy that he opened with a comment that he made that there's a child's right to be with their mother. And June just closed by thanking the holy babies that blessed us here. So it's a good opening and a closing that we had here in a good spiritual way. And also Daly, in her words, we've referenced her several times already. Claire in her presentation about courts and how they can use by the way, I'm glad you talked about plumbers, because anyone who's worked at the United Nations on the Declaration never says UNDRIP. It's the UN Declaration. That's how we reference 27 years of work over there. But I'm really happy you pointed out the lack of awareness in our communities, and that's a very, very important point. And Vicki, thank you for bringing us back to the cultural and spiritual ceremonies in your visits, because you acknowledge that they help you. And what a testimony that is to our spirituality, the spirituality of our peoples. And Dr. Miriam for reminding us about the spiritual element of health, that there's not only the mental, physical, and emotional, but the spiritual element of health, and the Indigenous perspective being important. Also, that it's about availability, accessibility, acceptability, and equal application. Thank you for those important messages. And if I were to pause here, I want to ask the men to join me on something. I want to make an observation here. The 4 mechanisms that we talk about at the international arena are all held currently by women. Awesome, right? Take a look at the expert mechanism. We have Erica there. Take a look at the special rapporteur, Vicki. Take a look at the permanent forum. We have Miriam there. Take a look at the voluntary fund. We have Claire there. Awesome. Thank you, women, for leading us on this good journey. In Erica's or Andrew's presentation, I wanted to, by technology here, refer to the commission that they're currently establishing in their territory on child apprehension, or children under state care, because that's a common challenge for all our Indigenous peoples. Erica, thank you again for bringing up the challenges in Brazil about land, and how there's probably a call for no more demarcations to be had for land, Indigenous lands in Brazil, because it's a move towards privatization in a way. Tommy, thank you for, again, going back to the spirituality, because he said Indigenous spirituality, like our relationship to the land, with the land, is difficult to express sometimes, so others can understand them. And of course, Kristen, thank you for bringing us back to the peaks and the spiritual aspect of that in terms of spirituality, land, and colonization was a good way to present it. And Naomi this morning brought us back to the children, and she gave us several options to consider in terms of promotion of child wellness, child and family wellness, really together. So Lexi, thank you for pointing us in a direction that we can learn from each other, as you have with the house of the Karelian languages, and with the nest approach to that. And June, of course, thank you for reminding us, as you just have, about the holy babies. I want to latch on a little bit to Al's comments about the gaps and how we need to close them. And thank you for illustrating very important areas to close the gaps, and then so that we can have a more full understanding. But it's depending on us. It's up to us. There's the old expression about don't point at anybody else anymore, because 3 of them are pointing it back at you. So it's up to us. It's like reconciliation. One man told us, you know what reconciliation means to me is that it starts with me. It starts with me. So thank you for, and also community organization. The word community, what are the last 5 letters in that word? And what do they spell out? It's unity. And we need to keep together, as our elder told us at the beginning of the discussion. It's about unity and organizing it so that we can see the benefits of the outcomes in that organization. And lastly, I want to close with, if I may use June's message, a responsibility-based approach. That's a whole new notion to a rights-based approach. And that's the Indigenous way, if I could say that. So in saying that, on behalf of Chief Ed John, I wish I could have said that, because I would have said it a whole lot better. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.